Are you fighting Azar for the first time? Did you just die to him? Maybe you don't feel like reading all this, or maybe you already know what he does, but you have a friend who's asking and you don't feel like typing up an essay. Well, this video is here to provide quick and easy explanations of everything you need to know in order to form your strategy for this fight. Everything I'll be describing will be for Expert Mode Blood Mist 4, but I'll add annotations for normal mode when necessary. So Azar has 3 distinct phases that you'll need to strategize for, but one constant mechanic that stays present throughout the whole fight. Let's go over that first, since you'll have to play around it throughout the entire battle. So Azar will summon these ultimate illusion swords, and he has 2 ways of doing so. One of them is Ultimate First Scroll, a skill he uses regularly in his first 2 phases. But the main way these bad boys get out into the field is through this debuff. One of these will be applied to a random skill in hand at the start of every turn. Now if a skill with this debuff leaves your hand at all, whether it's played, discarded, or excluded, Azar will spawn a sword. The only thing I found that gets around this is effects that copy or move skills back into your deck. For example, when Selena's Eclipse casts a debuffed spell, not only does the copied instance of the spell not spawn a sword, when you draw that spell again, the sword debuff is just gone. The same interaction happens with skills duplicated by Lucy's Meditate as well, but in general, expect a sword to eventually be spawned for every skill that gets this debuff. When a sword gets summoned, you'll see a choice dialog pop up on your screen, making you choose between 2 types of swords to summon, and also which investigator that sword will target. All swords have the same base stats in one attack, but each will have a unique passive that affects the battle in some way as long as it's alive. For your convenience, a list of all sword passives you can roll is pinned in the comments. Keep in mind that the swords do get an action on the same turn they're summoned, it's just that they're guaranteed to go after you hit that end turn button but before your next turn begins. Now, you are given some assistance to deal with them in the form of this Destroy Illusion Swords Lucy spell that gets created in your hand at the start of every turn. It costs 0 and has swiftness, Lucy does a cool little animation, and they all die. However, you'll have to carefully manage when you actually want to use this skill because you're only given 3 uses for the entire fight and it doesn't reset between phases. As long as you still have remaining uses, this spell will spawn in your hand at the beginning of every turn. And after you've used it 3 times, it just stops spawning. You can technically use it a 4th time if you copy it with Meditate, but that's more of like a fun party trick than an actual strategy. Swords defeated by the skill do trigger any on-death triggers that you might have in your relics and whatnot, so if you're running those synergies, make sure to account for that. And that's about the gist of the Ultimate Illusion Sword mechanic. One last thing to mention before talking about Azar's first phase is that all but one of his actions are used consistently and predictably based on the turn number. He does have one triggered action that I'll explain in more detail later, but all of his moves are telegraphed in the countdown stack, so you'll at the very least have one action count to react and plan around what he's doing. Now let's get right into his first phase. Azar's first phase is 462 HP on Expert Mode Blood Mist 4, and his regular actions are on a 3-turn cycle. On turn 1, he'll use Full Moon Slash and Ultimate First Scroll. At the beginning of turn 2, he'll buff himself with Shining Aura, and during his actual turn, he'll use Full Moon Slash again and Ultimate Ascending Slice. Turn 3, he uses Ultimate First Scroll and Fantasy. On turn 4, this cycle repeats and so forth as long as he's in his first phase. He also has a triggered action called Ultimate Storming Blade, which is used every 7th non-created investigator skill you cast from hand. Now I'll go into more detail for each of these moves. Full Moon Slash gets used on turns 1 and 2. You can't see its target by hovering over the skill, but it basically attacks a random investigator plus an investigator of your choice, with the one that you choose receiving a debuff that makes them take double damage from the Illusion Sword's attacks. And yes, you can choose the investigator who received the first attack to also receive the second one. Next, we have Ultimate First Scroll. Ultimate First Scroll is used on turns 1 and 3. It deals damage to the target indicated by the skill and summons a sword. Note that who this skill targets has nothing to do with who the sword will target for its own attacks, you'll have to choose that. Now for Shining Aura. You'll first notice him using it at the beginning of turn 2 before you get to make any actions. And he will use this every 3 turns regardless of phase, so you'll see this again on turn 5, then turn 8, and so on. This isn't a damaging action, it just buffs him with the Shining Aura buff. As you can see, while this buff is active, investigators that get hit by a sword will have a stack of Deep Cut applied to them, which deals pain damage at the start of turn and will also make them take pain damage if you cast one of their skills from hand. And that leads me right into talking about Ultimate Ascending Slice, which is also used on turn 2. This attack does chunky damage to one investigator, and if there are any swords on the field, they will each slap their target as long as the target isn't already at death's door. Keep in mind this doesn't consume their action, they'll still get their normal attack when it's their turn. Also, these attacks will deal double damage to investigators with the Illusion Sword weakness debuff, and if Azar has Shining Aura active, apply the Deep Cut debuff that we talked about earlier. So while it's nice that your investigators can actually die from these sword attacks, you'll still probably want to avoid letting Azar use this skill when there are a lot of swords on the field. Next, we've got everyone's favorite Azar rare skill, Fantasy. Except it's the boss Azar's version, so unfortunately, we're not getting anything for free. Anyways, on turn 3, he'll use Fantasy after using Ultimate First Scroll. Fantasy is basically the game's way of preventing you from just stockpiling all the debuff spells in your hand and never casting them. Fantasy will exclude all the debuffed spells in your hand, and as a result, summon a sword for each spell excluded. However, there's a spawn limit of 4 swords, so if a 5th one would spawn, nothing happens. And the last skill you have to know about in Phase 1 is Ultimate Storming Blade. Ultimate Storming Blade is a skill Azar will use based on the number of non-Lucy, non-created skills you've cast from hand. You can see how many skill casts you have left by checking this buff icon on the boss. When there's no number on the icon, that means it's the last stack, so when you cast your next skill, Azar will respond with Ultimate Storming Blade. The move itself will do some chunky damage and apply a stun, so make sure you pay attention to the stacks unless you have consistent ways of dealing with CC. And that's it for the mechanics of his first phase. I find the mechanics of his first phase to be less demanding than his second phase, so I like to make sure that my hand is equipped to get through his second phase pretty quickly before I actually bring him below 1 HP. Once you would bring him below 1 HP on the first phase, this animation plays and he automatically transitions to his second phase. Azar in the second phase has the same amount of HP as his first phase, but a new mechanic gets introduced to the fight, and this mechanic sets the tone for the whole phase. In fact, the entire phase is about playing around it, so. First of all, you'll notice that a bunch of stuff has spawned in your hand. If you still have uses of Destroy Illusion Sword left, that'll still spawn like it has been. Then the rest of your hand will be filled with these dummy skills if you have space before the last hand slot. Deflect will always spawn in the last slot of your hand during this phase, and along with all this, Azar will now cast Illusion Wave at the end of every turn. It's probably going to be easier to understand what this skill does after seeing its animation once, so let's just let Azar have his moment for a bit here. So while Illusion Wave itself is not a high damage skill, its effect gets more devastating if you allow it to cut any of your skills. When it cuts a skill, not only does that skill get excluded, its owner will take extra damage. These are separate instances of damage, so your healing gauge will get destroyed if you get hit by the base attack and the damage from getting a skill cut. Also, remember that if he cuts a skill with the Illusion Sword debuff, it will summon a sword. So, given all that, your goal with all this clutter in your hand is to make sure you get Deflect to percolate above the skills you want to keep by the time you're ready to end your turn. Ideally, getting it all the way to the top of your hand would prevent the most damage, but you need to evaluate whether you can do that while still outputting enough damage to kill the boss. Also, you can always let it cut Destroy Illusion Sword with no repercussions because no one takes extra damage for Lucy skills and it'll spawn a new one next turn anyways. So how do you move Deflect around? Basically, whenever you play another skill from hand, Deflect will move up or down based on its cost. If you play a skill above Deflect, Deflect will move up a number of slots equal to the mana cost of whatever you just played. If you play a skill below Deflect, it will move down however many slots equal to the mana cost of the skill you just played. That's also why the game fills your hand with dummies, so you can cast them for the sole purpose of moving Deflect around as needed. Basically, you should avoid ending up in a situation where you've started your turn by playing something high mana and then the second skill you wanted to cast is now below it, but you don't have enough mana to both play that spell and push Deflect back up. One thing to note about the dummy skills in your hand is that they will never cause your hand to overflow. If you cast a draw spell while your hand is full of dummies, they will exclude themselves to make space for what you just drew. Aside from casting Illusion Wave at the end of every turn, Phase 2 Azar will do 1 regular attack per turn on a 3-turn cycle. Then, once you bring him below 1 HP in Phase 2, the Lucy's Assault skill will spawn at the bottom of your hand. Yeah, it's kind of inconvenient with the whole Deflect thing, but it is what it is. It has 99 countdown, which basically means it's guaranteed to go after Azar gets a last Illusion Wave in, and then after that resolves, you will officially be in Phase 3. Also, just something interesting, you can't use command combat to proceed to phase 3 early. You can try and it'll do the destroy all swords thing, which is nice, but it will not be able to trigger the phase change. Okay, and now we're finally in phase 3. You can no longer target Azar because your goal is to now kill the 2 pillars next to him, but at the same time, or as close to the same time as possible. When the first turn of phase 3 starts, before you can take any actions, you will be asked to choose a buff that his pillars will have. Choose whichever one is easier to play around for your deck, but some of them are obviously more devastating than others, like exclude the top skill of your deck every turn might be a little bit worse than a pretty low chance to stun one investigator on death. Now Azar will no longer use any attacks besides the instances of Ultimate Blade Starfall you see in the countdown stack over here. His pillars don't attack, they just stand by when it's their turn. However, Ultimate Blade Starfall isn't really a normal attack, they actually trigger when you play non-Lucy skills from your hand. Basically, if you play an Investigator skill from hand and there are Ultimate Blade Starfalls still in the countdown stack, one instance will fire right after the skill's effect, assuming you're not playing a skill with countdown. Now for what it actually does. It's an AoE attack dealing similar base damage to Illusion Wave, but it has a chance to apply bleed, and thankfully it is fairly low accuracy. Also, it's not a true AoE because if you have Investigator skills in hand, the Investigator that owns the topmost skill will not be attacked. So, assuming you're playing with the full party, it'll effectively only hit 3 out of 4 Investigators at a time. But since you're pretty much guaranteed to be coming out of phase 2 with exposed green bar, be careful not to let your healing gauge get completely destroyed by these AoE attacks. And now, the last thing you need to be mindful of during this phase, once you kill one of the pillars, you only have 4 skill plays to kill the other one before the dead one respawns at half HP. So, while you don't have to kill them on the exact same action, you should still try to kill them as close together as possible. It's important to note that your fixed skills do count towards the limit, so just be wary of that as you plan out your 4 actions. Once you get both swords dead for real, congrats! The fight is over, you've done it, all that's left to do is to play that final duel skill that shows up in your hand, and that will automatically end the fight. And that's it, that's the whole Azar fight. Hope this helped, good luck, and don't fuck